Hello and welcome. My name is Aoudi, and this lesson titled Session and Authentication is part of the Web Application Security course. For more information about the course and the lesson and to get lesson material, you can visit my website at samaraudi.com. This lesson is divided into three sections. In the first section, I will go over important session and authentication concepts specifically related to the security of web applications. I will also do a demo, and that would be the second section, and then the third is to go over the practical task that you guys will be doing at the end of the lesson. Okay, so let us get started. I explained in an earlier lesson that HTTP works in a request-response model whereby the client sends an HTTP request asking for something from a server, and the server responds back with an HTTP response with the resource that the client asked for. Although HTTP is great and it's what makes the web works, it has a problem. HTTP is stateless or connectionless. That means this protocol doesn't have the mechanism to establish and maintain a connection between the client and the server. You can think of a connection as a continuous conversation between the client and the server. So what does that really mean? Imagine that I go to a website and I say, hey, Mr. Website, it's me, Samer, this is my username and password. The server would say, hey, Samer, welcome, this is your profile page. And then I would say, click a link, let's say, show me my account balance. And I send it in a request to the server. Because HTTP is connectionless, the server would say, hey, who are you again? So it doesn't really know that it's me who just been authenticated. And that is a problem. The fact that HTTP is stateless makes it almost impossible to have a useful and usable web application. So again, HTTP does not have the ability to, by default, to maintain a connection between the client and the server. So what that means is that the HTTP request response pairs, each pair is totally independent and unaware of other HTTP request response pairs. So the solution for this is in the form of the session. And what happens when we have a session is that the client sends a request and the server, with the response, the first response, it creates a unique session ID, or a session token is known, and sends it back to the client. From that point forward, whenever the client sends a request, it sends along with that request the same session token, telling the server, hey, it's me and that's my ID. Using the session token, we can establish this continuous conversation whereby the server knows that it's you. Let's try to understand this session object a little bit more. So we said that the session is this unique identifier, a unique ID or token that the server creates, and it sends back to the client telling it, hey, this is your token. Using this token, I know it's you. The session token is typically saved in the web browser window, and I will show you that in the demo. What happens if the browser window is closed, the session dies with it. But as long as it's open, every subsequent request, the client or the web browser sends that token and therefore the server know it's that browser or that client. And finally, when the browser is closed and the session is not saved permanently, then the session dies, and in the next request the server wouldn't know it's me, and then they would issue a new session to identify me. However, sometimes in less secure website, maybe the server saves this token permanently in what we know as the cookie, which is a text file that resides on our computer. So more about that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and start a demo about these concepts. I will go to my demo website and I will go to session. Let me just make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so in this web page, you see I have a message says hello guest. It doesn't know yet who I am, and there is a session ID that was created by the server when I sent the request, and the server sent it back to me. However, for demo purpose, I'm displaying this session ID so that you guys can see it. Okay, so what I will do now, I will provide some information to tie that information with this ID, and therefore the server would know more about me. But before that, let me show you a couple of things. I will refresh, and it's still the same ID. Okay, so notice the first three characters, Q8E. Okay, now let me try something else. I'm gonna close the browser, reopen it, and the session died, and I made a new request when I opened the browser because I visited this page. So the server said, hey, no session? Well, here you go. This is a session ID that will identify you. So this is what I meant by the session object living in the browser window. So let's go ahead and tie this session with information about me. So I'm gonna provide my information, Samer, Palestine. I'm Palestinian, by the way. And my favorite color, let's say blue, you see? Information is already there. So I will go now, click this button, providing this information to another page. So here I see that my information, Samer from Palestine, is associated with this session ID. To make it more permanent, what I also did in that web page, and you will see it and do it in your practical activity, is that I saved it in the cookie along with some other information. So this is the cookie information, username Samer, I put something hidden, role is admin, and this is the session ID, which is again is read from the browser. The token is in the browser. These, however, are saved now in a cookie. My cookie here, I put a timeout on it, and the timeout is 1 minute. So maybe by the time I finish and I show it to you, it will be gone. So what I will do, I will close this, reopen, and now take a look what happened. Guest, the country not set, a new ID, and yes, the information that I provided is gone. So I'm gonna repeat this, but a little bit more quickly, because like I said, I timed out my session. Let's put red now. Okay, so this is my information. Now I'm gonna close and reopen. Oops. And you see here, Palestine, color red, role admin, and the same ID. Okay, so if I go to another page, it's still the same ID. And again, if I go and I put Samer again, and I go here and I go to another page, it's still Samer and it's still the same token. So the session is a great thing. It actually solves the problem of this stateless HTTP protocol. However, in terms of security, the session itself poses a security risk, especially if it's not managed properly. So what happens, for example, if somebody gets my session? Remember, the session is supposed to uniquely identify me, right? So what happens if somebody else gets my session? Well, according to the server, they become me. Let me show you this also very quickly. So this is Samer, and this is my ID. Okay, I'm gonna copy this. I will go to another browser. So this could be basically, let me just actually copy this page. Okay, so this is, as you see, it's a totally different ID. Let me make this a little bit bigger. So it's a totally different token, and it doesn't have any information about me, right? So what I will do now here is go to a special page where I created. That page gives me the ability to set the session ID. So let me copy this. Okay, now this is the session ID. Okay, so let me go back to this page now. So I'm gonna make a request to the server, and look, the request went to the server saw my ID, and they said, oh, this is Samer, so welcome back, Samer. So as you see, the session is really dangerous in terms of security, that the session can help the attacker gain access to very important resources without even having to authenticate or without having to provide or brute force the username and password. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about session management and security in a bit. So because session is so important, we must manage it properly. So in this slide, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the different steps of session management. So imagine that I go to a website for the first time, still didn't provide username and password. Maybe the website is not secure at that point, so it's using HTTP. So the server will issue for me a less secure session. We call it the pre-authentication session. And I surf the website. But at some point, I will provide my username and password and I get authenticated. So the server, a proper secure web application, the server would issue a new session token for me, and now the communication, since the authentication is more secure, it's HTTPS, which is an encrypted connection over SSL, and this is a new session token given to me after authentication. And like I just showed you in the demo, I can associate that with not just my username and password, but also with things like my role, and therefore I can tie it to access control, what I'm allowed and not allowed to do and see on this website. And finally, when everything is done, I have to properly dispose of the session and terminate it. So let me give you here two examples, and let's start talking about security as well. Let's say I go to my bank's website and I provide my username and password, and I'm given this post-authentication session token. What happens if I don't do anything on that web page? My browser window is still open, but I don't do anything, no activity for 5 minutes. Typically, the session, you'll get a message that you haven't done anything and you're about to be logged off or even close the browser window. But so the web application put a short timeout on the session and definitely didn't save it in a cookie and said, this is over, this conversation is over for security purpose. Versus if you go to a website like Facebook, you log in, you check that box, checkbox that says remember me, and then you close your browser window, you shut down your computer, you never open it for a week, you reopen your computer, go to Facebook, and guess what? Facebook still remembers you. You don't have to provide your username and password. So this is where security is not really as big a deal as in a bank or a financial website. So therefore, session information is more persistently or permanently saved in that file called the cookie. Okay, so let's now talk about some of the weaknesses and associated attacks related to session. If somebody get a hold of your session, as I just showed you, they can become new. And therefore, attackers do spend time and effort trying to steal sessions from existing users or, if they can, from the web application itself. Another technique is that the session is not necessarily stolen but guessed or predicted by the attacker, simply because the web application's way of creating that session is not done right. That means it's not random enough and can be easily guessed. So what happened in this situation, the attacker would be able to guess a future session and waits until that session is issued, and therefore, again, they would gain access to restricted areas. And finally, and probably easier technique, technically, which is to, instead of steal or predict the session, the attacker would set or fix the session of a victim for that particular web application. Just like I showed you, I actually set that session to be SAMR using a URL parameter. So session fixation is where the attacker gives you the session and then wait for you to access that web application, get authenticated, and then what they do is simply go to their web page, refresh, and basically sending a request to the server, and the server will think that you, the attacker, are actually the legitimate user. Okay, so let's do a little demo here. So I'm gonna go back to this website and I'm gonna here go to session hijacking. So what I did in this page, I combined a technique that I showed you in an earlier lesson, which is Crosssite scripting and link injection. And I use this page. So let's say this is a phishing email or a fake website where I tell you, hey, click this link or click this button. Notice here what you will see when I put the mouse over this. So you will see some information. If you notice, if it's clear, precious equal role, admin, PHP session ID equals something, and so on. This is nice, but the user can't see it. So I'm doing the same thing. Instead of using URL parameters, I'm using here forms. So therefore, you will not be able to see that to most users weird information. So basically, I got the session, and this is again for demo. I'm showing you this web page. This web page is where I store I actually don't store it in the web page, okay? I store it in the database, but this is the web page where I display the stolen sessions. So all of these users are my victims, and they are in the database. Of course, all of these users are me visiting this web page over and over again. So as you see, this is the most recent session ID and some information that I stole from the user. Okay, so this is session hijacking. If you want to know how to do it, again, you would do the practical activity. Also, you can revisit the cross-site scripting practical activity where we did something similar. Next, I will show you a web page called Session Fixation, which I created. If you notice here, I have a URL parameter called Session ID. The web page, this particular web page, I created it in a way that it reads the value of the session ID and put it in the actual session ID. I'm using here PHP framework. So I will show you again how it's done. So basically now anybody who visits this web page will have their PHP session ID equal to 123 ABC 567. So if I go back here, for example, remember this page, the session ID is the same. Okay, so this is session fixation. Okay, let's go back and let's talk about how we can protect ourselves and our web applications against session flows and attacks. There are some guidelines and best practices. Always try to combine the session token or ID with another way of identifying the user, such as the IP address. So if I see a session token ABC123 from IP address A, and then I again see the same ID from IP address B, I know there's a problem and I would force the authentication. Which takes me to the second point here. Enforce re-authentication even if there isn't any alarm, but do it for important transactions. So again, imagine you're on a web site of a bank, you already logged in, and now you're transferring money. At that point, re-authenticate or ask for another password for sending money. When you are transmitting session, do it over a secure connection, SSL, and make sure you dispose of your sessions. Don't leave them hanging. So time them out properly. Don't save them here permanently in a cookie unless you have to. Like in some websites or application you might need to, but if you do it, encrypt it again so that the attackers wouldn't look at their own session ID and try to get a pattern and then guess it. If you have a pre-authentication and post-authentication session management on your website, make sure that the post-authentication sessions, which are typically transmitted over SSL, are more secure and therefore should be different from the ones that are pre-authentication. Do not reinvent the wheel. If you're creating a session, use the modern and secure frameworks like J2EE, like PHP, like .NET, and these have some good session creation which creates really random session tokens. And like I said, if you're gonna do it, ensure total randomness and do not reuse old session, because it means that if an attacker uses your website, get a hold of a session, they keep it, and then at some point you will reuse that session with another user, and that is a problem. So when I talked about session management, we said that session is very closely related to authentication and access control. I mean, the practical use of a session is when you authenticate the user and then you give them access to certain places in your web application. So when we talk about session, we must also talk about authentication, because the attack can come from either side. If I get your session, I can become you and there is no need for authentication. But if we have weak authentication management on our web application, then no need to attack the session. I can simply log in as a user. So these are some of the authentication weaknesses. Weak passwords. So if you allow weak passwords in your website, then maybe the attackers can guess them. So always enforce strong password policy, 8 to 9 characters, alphanumeric with special characters, at least one uppercase, and so on. When you store your passwords, ensure that you encrypt them, you hash them, and even better, solve them. So let's say somebody's password is Apple, which is a weak password. Before you hash it and encrypt it and store it on your database, add some random string to it, so it becomes, for example, Apple XYZ123, and then hash that. So this would be a better way in case the attacker, for example, using SQL injection, was able to gain access to your database. When you transmit passwords, or during authentication, for example, make sure that you do it over a secure SSL connection. Otherwise, if somebody is eavesdropping, they can see that information. And finally, limit the login attempts. Don't allow unlimited attempts. Otherwise, the attacker can brute force your website, and eventually they can guess the username and password. Keep trying and trying and trying. This is brute force. And finally, some websites have logical problems or weaknesses in the way that they allow users to change the password or reset them. So you base it on a weak security question, for example. Just to reset the password of a user, you simply ask them for a secret question, and some users use very identifiable information that the attacker can get from their social media websites, and therefore anybody can guess the answers to these questions. Okay, this is it for the theory part, and we did a couple of demos. So let's move on to the practical task that you guys will be performing shortly. Okay, so what I will do, I will go to the course web page and start the course. Go to session and authentication, go to the practical activity, and explain a few things. So if you remember, I'm using a virtual machine. You really don't have to, but it's better, I think, for me, and it also shows you a more realistic scenario in my demo website, where I'm accessing the website from my physical, so from the host to the guest. In here, if you remember, we have the Vertigo server bundle that has PHP, MySQL, and Apache web server, and it must be on. You have this icon which is green plus sign, meaning the server is on, and if you click it, you have access to some options. This is the www folder, which is the default. So that's my IP address of the virtual machine, and this is the www folder, and that's the default website. But under it, what I did, we created a folder called web apps, and in a previous practical we created index, XSS, XSS evil, XSS results. In this one, we will create session fix, session set, session test, and session test 2. Okay, so let me explain few things when you're doing the practical, specifically when you're looking at code. So because I provide you with the initial web pages or the files, you can download them by the way here. It's a zip file. You can unzip it in your web apps folder. Please make sure when you extract them, you don't have a subfolder created, okay? So keep them here in web apps. Okay, so I provide you with the shell and so that you can focus specifically on the code of this activity. So the code in red, this red color code, is the code that you must add. But to show you where the code goes, I show you in gray the code that goes above it. For example, if you notice here, I say start copy below. That means you're gonna go when you see this. If you're lazy, you will copy paste into your web page. Let's say this is session set. You do it under the echo session ID. Okay, so again, the code snippets highlighted in red is the stuff that you need to add. Okay, so let me explain what we're doing here. Okay, I think this is big enough. So the first thing that you will do in sessionset.php is to write a PHP code block. By the way, PHP, for those of you who are new to it, is a server-side programming language, and therefore the PHP code that you write will not be sent to the client. If I view source, I will not be able to see it. I'll be able to see its output. Okay, so if I go here, this is the session set. Okay, if I view source, I will not be able to see any PHP code. Okay, none of that. So I only see its output, whatever that code produced. Okay, so this code, I say if the session is not set, so this is not, that's the session object, then go ahead and start it. This is great, but to show it to you, this is where I say session ID is equal to whatever the session ID was given by the server. So to do that, inside my HTML code, I have another PHP code block, and inside it I use the echo operator, and I use the session underscore ID function. This will give me the session token. So the output would be here, what you see in front of you. So the page already has the structure. All you have to do is write the code associated with it. Next is to create that form. Okay, it's a little bit different from my form. To keep it simple for you, I use only one input parameter. So notice here that the form uses post, and the page that handles the forms or the form or receives it is session test.php, and basically there's an input called username. The name is very important, okay, because that's the name that this page would be expecting and waiting for. The placeholder, by the way, is this, what you see written. As soon as I put the mouse and I highlight it, it disappears and comes back. So this is an attribute, a nice attribute that gives you that option. And finally, a submit button. So next is to create the session test, which is the page that will receive that form with its data. The way that PHP does that is using a global variable called $_post. For each element in the form, you can have a post variable. So I'm saying here, if post username, remember this is the username exactly as you see it here, case sensitive. If it's not equal to null, that means it's not empty and the user didn't come to this page directly, then use this super global variable, which is $_session. I just call it username. I could have called it anything I want, by the way. So use this and set the value to whatever the user provided. So if you remember, I put Samer now will be inside this. If the user comes to the page directly, like when I reopen the web browser, then set it to guest. Okay, and then I echo it, I display it. And in here I explain the post and the session variables. An important note before I continue, the post scope is it's global within the page itself. That means I can refer to it anywhere in the page and I can say, hey, echo this post variable, and you will see what's inside it. But if I go to another page and I never set this and I say echo post username, then it will say, hey, I don't know what's that. So it's only visible within a web page. This, on the other hand, is visible within the application. That's how, when I go from one page to another, I can still see my username in it. Okay, so I have some questions here for you. And then you're gonna move to the session hijacking. And basically to do that, we're gonna add a snippet of code where we create the cookie. So let me explain how this works. The set cookie function takes in a name, so that's the name, username, and notice here I used capital U, so that's the name I'm setting for the cookie variable. Then the value of this username is whatever is inside the session variable. So in this case was Samer, will go inside this, and then a timeout. The current time, I get it using the time function plus 300 seconds, so that's 5 minutes. In the actual code that I just demoed for you, I put it 60 seconds, 1 minute, just so that you can see its effect. And then its path, so this is nothing, it's just the default path. Okay, now from the Crosssite scripting code, you go to this page, okay, and then you can copy this. What does this do? It creates a variable called victim. It puts in it the cookie information. It creates a variable called X and gets all the A elements. Remember, the A elements are the links, and then uses the first one. So in this page, the first link is this. Look, it's home, which is index.php. If you take a look here down, it's index.php. But when I do this link injection, I actually, so if you notice here again, it's different. Okay. So you will be doing this reflected client XSS. What I showed you in my session hijacking page, this page, is a server XSS. So this is the attacker's web page where it has the XSS or the link injection code within it. Okay, but because we didn't cover databases yet, in your activity you'll be doing the client XSS. Some questions and independent task, and then we do the session fixation. The session fixation is very easy. You create this session fix. It's actually already created. You just go inside it and add this code. So if you notice, this code we have used before, but before we start the session with a random PHP session token, I say session ID, set it to whatever you get. So this is the $_get is the get variable. It's again a global variable called SID. Now in my demo session fixation, I called it session ID. In your practical, according to this, it's called SID. That means in your web page, you will see something called SID equals to whatever value it will be taken, and the session ID will be equal to it. Okay, so you will get something like this. Okay, so any value that you put, this page will read it and put it inside the session ID, and then it will start the session, which will be equal to whatever you fixed. Okay, so again, this is, let me zoom out. This is chapter 4, actually, not chapter 3, which is session and authentication. And I hope that you enjoyed and benefited from this lesson. If you did, please do not forget to subscribe. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.